What up, YouTube? It's your boy Anthony back with a quick video. And in this one, I just want to give you a tip on how to get your exposure to be where you need it to be, regardless of what computer or what monitor, what brightness setting. None of that matters because I'm going to use the histogram and I'm going to use the color value percentages to get that exposure where I want it to be. Now, this obviously isn't a dead set fast way of how to get the exposure. You really have to evaluate the scene, and your creative editing is going to play a factor. So it's not going to be the same value every time, and this isn't going to get that exposure exactly perfect every single time, but it definitely will make sure that you're in the ballpark. And you kind of have to figure out your own percentages, especially if you print photos. The percentages that I use work very well for the print lab that I use and how I like to print photos. That could be different for how you like to print photos, or how you like to edit your photos, or the medium in which you're putting your photos out there, whether it's website, social media, whatever. But these values will definitely get you in the ballpark. So without further ado, let's jump into the computer and let me tell you what I'm talking about. So essentially what I use is the histogram, and I like to use the color values at the bottom, specifically the red channel. So depending upon what skin tone you're doing this for, it is going to change. The percentages that you're going to look for lighter complexion is going to be different than the percentages that you would look for darker complexions. So for light skin, the first one that we have here is a fair skinned individual. So for light skin, I typically like to go for 70 to 85% in the red channel. Now, when I'm figuring out where I want to get that value, it is very important that you pick the right spot. Because if you come up here and you put it over a highlight area, obviously that's going to be a bright spot. So your values are going to be higher than the overall exposure on your subject. Same as if you come into a shadow area, your values are going to be way lower than the overall exposure on your subject. So you really need to find an area that is exposed by your light source, but it's not a hot spot and it's not a shadow. So I typically will focus either on the forehead area or somewhere on the cheek that's facing towards the key light, and I use that as my baseline. And so again, for light skin, I typically like to have the range somewhere in between 70 and 85% for light skin. So if we come down here into this area right here and we look at our percentages, we can see that we're at 68%. And of course, these were studio shots, so they were exposed how they should be exposed. So there's not going to need to be a lot of changes that I need to do for these. But I do this same method even if I'm doing natural light outdoor shots. It's the same thing. I'm focusing on the subject. I'm finding a spot on the skin that is exposed based on my key light, and then I use that as the marker. So in this case, if we come right here and we're at 60, we're at 70% ish on the red channel. At most, I might bump that up just a couple on the exposure there to get it somewhere in between that 70 and 85. So again, your images are going to dictate where you're going to be in that range. I don't always go to 70. I don't always go to 85. It really depends on the scene. If the scene is more of a brighter type scene, then I might err on the side of going more towards 85, where if it's a little bit more low key or a little bit more normal average scene, then I might be closer to the 70. So you really have to analyze the scene first. But again, this does at least get you in the ballpark. So right now we're at 72. If we take it up a little bit more, that puts us into, the 77. That's a little hot. So for this one, I would probably try to get it somewhere around 75. So I would bring it up, 0.3, and that looks really good to me. So if we go to another example here, got lighter skin as well. So we're already pushing, somewhere around 76, which is pretty good. Again, I probably should have gotten better examples because these were some headshots that I did like 5 or 6 years ago. So obviously the exposure is pretty good, but this still illustrates how I would do this. So just for the sake of showing the demonstration, let's take the exposure down a half a stop here. So if we come over here, you would see that I'm falling, if we look at that histogram, I'm more in like the upper 60s range. So this would be a tad underexposed for me. And where this method is really helpful is that even if I was on a monitor that the brightness was way too much, I can look at that value, and if it's in the 60s range, it doesn't matter how bright it looks on the monitor, I still know that that exposure is not where I personally want it to be. So I'm going to bump it up. This is important for me because if it looks overexposed on the monitor and I don't have a way to be able to use the histogram data to be able to determine if that exposure is where I want it to be, then if I'm using a different computer, or if I'm using a laptop, or for whatever the case, if something's not right, the brightness is up too high, then I'm going to think that the exposure is good on my images. But then when I send it to my print lab to print, it's going to come back underexposed. Or if I send it to the client, it could potentially be underexposed. Now, keep in mind, obviously, when you're sending stuff out to a client, if you have it perfect on your computer and their monitor is way too bright or way too underexposed, then your image is going to change based on how they're viewing it. So you can't do anything about that. I totally get it. But this at least helps to make sure, especially from a print perspective, that you're getting that exposure right where it needs to be. So right now, I took it down a half a stop, and so that puts us in that 65, 66, 67 range. So if this was a real example and I wanted to bring that up to get it to where I want it to be, obviously bringing it up a half a stop puts me right in that 74, 75 range, and that's where I think looks good for this particular image. So let's move to a medium skin, darker skin. Darker skin is definitely going to be different. I think a lot of photographers, I could say the word struggle. They probably don't think that they struggle, but a lot of photographers do not expose darker skin correctly. Cameras definitely do not meter for darker skin correctly. Cameras will want to bring up the exposure of darker skin, and then you ultimately overexpose that skin and you lose the rich tones of darker skin, and you don't want to do that. So for darker skin, I'm obviously not going to go for the same values that I went with the fairer skin, because that would ultimately overexpose that. So this is an example of darker skin, but this is more on the side of medium darker skin versus darker skin, if that makes any sense. So she's more of a chocolate complexion. And so for this type of skin tone, I'm typically going somewhere in between the 50 to 65% range. So again, I want to make sure that I'm not going for a highlight. We want the exposure to be good, but we don't necessarily want to go for a highlight where it's going to be brighter than the overall skin tone for the subject. So this is a little hot. I typically wouldn't use this area right here. So I'm going to come down here to the cheek area here. And you can see that we're hovering in the mid 50s, which isn't bad. I think it looks pretty good. Again, these were studio shots, so of course they're going to look good exposure wise. But if we were to bump that up just a couple of notches and get that more towards the 60 range, that still looks really good. Now, for the sake of it, let's look at what happens if we get this into the 70 to 85% range. You can see that her skin tone is way overexposed. So we can't use the same values for light skin as we do darker skin, and this is why. And a lot of people will edit their photos this way and deliver photos this way to the client. And as a black person, the worst thing that we can get is a photo that makes us look lighter than we are. Most black people love their skin tones. They love their shades. And when you take pictures of them and you deliver images where their skin tone is a lot lighter than what it is in person, it really is an insult to darker skinned individuals. So you want to make sure that you're not doing that. So again, for this medium chocolate skin, I'm going for 50 to 65% in that red channel. And that gets me right to a nice medium that I'm happy with. So if we move on to darker skin, for darker skin, I'm aiming for 40 to 55% in that red channel for darker skin. So just for the sake of it, to show that there is a difference between that chocolate skin and that darker skin, if I get this particular image, if we get it up to that 50 to 65 range, so right now we're hovering in the low 30s. So if we get that up to the 50 to 65 range here, You can see that right now, okay, so it's at, 55%. That is too bright for his skin tone. So if we clear that back out and you see the richness, the darkness in his skin tone, if we get that to that 55% range, in my opinion, that's too overexposed. That is making his skin more light than what it is, and I don't like that. So for darker skin, I'm aiming for that 40 to 55% range. So right now he's hovering in the upper 30s. So if we just bring that up just a few notches, let's get it, say, in the 45% range, I think that looks really good right there. So this is just a method that I use, again, that I've kind of perfected over time in editing a bunch of images and getting a feel for how I like it to be exposed, how it's printing well, and what these values are. I've just kind of developed these numbers, and it's what works for me. Again, I would encourage you to go through your images, look at how you like to edit images, or look at the images that you're printing and figure out what your numbers should be. By all means, you can try these numbers and they may work out well for you, may work out very well. But you really need to look at your images and how you edit things and figure out what your range is and use that range. And then once you do that, you can use these numbers to make sure that your exposure is good on whatever images that you're using. So that is that, but I actually have a bonus tip for you. So there's a slider, there's something that you can do when you're editing to give skin a little bit more of a tanned look. Or if it's darker skin, you can make that chocolate, that brown, be just a little bit more rich. Let me tell you how really quick. So if we come in here, let's go back to this image here. If we come down to the color panel and we go to the orange, if you adjust the luminance down, you can add a little bit of tanness to the skin. Now, ultimately what you're doing is just lowering the luminosity of the orange channel, okay? So you definitely want to be careful. You don't want to go too crazy and do something like this. This looks terrifying. Don't do anything like this. But if you bring that down just a little bit and kind of look at it, you can see where you're just making that skin just look a little bit more tan. So without it, it's like this here. And if we just add in and just bring that back just a little bit, you can tan that skin a little bit. So let's come here and we'll do it again. So you can see here, this individual is a little bit more pale. So if we just bring down the luminosity in that orange channel, you can see, so here's without it. And here's with it. Now you see it's very easy to go too far. You obviously would never want to do this. And even this is too much right here. You want to make sure that you keep it natural, but this is just a way just to take pale skin and make it just a little bit more tan. Typically, people like to look tan, especially people with more fair skin. They like to look tan. So this is kind of a quick and easy way just to bring in just a little bit. You're not going to take someone that's like pale white and make them look like they've been living in California for 10 years. Not going to be able to do that with this method, but this is a way just to add a little bit of richness to the skin, and it works just the same for medium and darker skin as well. So if we take this image right here and we bring that luminosity down, you can see that we just really bring out the richness of those brown tones in this skin. Again, it is easy to go too far. You don't want to do something like this, but you definitely can just bring down that luminosity just to make that skin pop. And if we come to one of these images with the darker skin, it works just the same. You can bring that down just a little bit just to really bring out the colors and the richness of those skin tones. So there you have it, just a couple of quick tips to help you with your exposure. If you found this helpful, go ahead, give your boy a thumbs up. It helps the video, help gets it in front of more people. You guys know the drill and all that stuff already. So yeah, hopefully this was a helpful video for you. I intend to do more videos like this in the future, but I always intend to do something in the future, and who knows if it's going to work out or not. Time will tell. But I intend to do more quick videos like this just to give you some tips and things that I've kind of just discovered or learned or came up with over the course of time. So hopefully you've been staying safe, staying healthy, but at the same time getting out there and enjoying life and enjoying the world for what it is. So that is all that I have in this video. Until the next one, take care.